Thank you. My first real acquaintance with Bishop Hill came not in this country, but in Sweden. I was at a folk high school called Biskopsarne, which is just a few miles away from a little village called, very strangely enough, Biskopskola, Bishop Hill, in Uppland. And I was kind of intrigued by it because as a kid, my father and grandfather would occasionally bring me out here to show me those strange pictures on the walls of the colony church of 100 and some immigrant figures who had been painted by a very famous artist in Bishop Hill. And it kind of stuck with me. And then in the late 60s, a Swedish researcher by the name of Olof Isaksson from the Museum of National Antiquities came over here with his wife and family and spent a summer living in the old colony hotel, which at that time was recently taken over by the state of Illinois, but not taken over very well, because Olaf fell through the stairwell into the floor underneath as part of his initial experience visiting this community, but it did not spoil his interest in the place. And so he did a very fine exhibit on the story of Bishop Hill or Biskopskola, which showed in Stockholm and then traveled all over the country. And it gives you a sense of how the word about this place continues to come back time and again after the time of the Great Migration back in the 1840s and 50s. And so when I was asked to give a talk, the thought struck me what I might do is tell you about the two last letters that Eric Janson wrote to Bishop Hill just before he was murdered, literally just a couple of weeks before he was murdered. And they had been found in the archives here by an interesting editor from the Augustana Synod called Ernst Olsson, who turned out to be the editor of the Ungdomsvännen, the youth organ of the Augustana Church. And he wrote two really extensive stories about Bishop Hill, I think with the hope that he pointed some of the youth of the church back in the direction of the Lutheran side of it. I don't know how it succeeded or not, but the church lasted a long time. At any rate, Eric Janson was, of course, well known by the 1840s in Sweden for his efforts to proselytize and win a lot of people to the pietistic beliefs of the Swedes of the 1840s. And he was so popular that it was encouraged that he should leave and come to the United States. So he took about 1,100 of his followers over a period of over a year and brought them from Hälsingland and Gästrikland and Uppland all the way across the ocean on sailing vessels and brought them to what became today's Bishop Hill. At least those that survived got here. But the bottom line was Bishop Hill was founded with about 700 to 800 people from the 1,100 that originally created the Eric Jansonist movement in Sweden. And among the things that Eric Janson did was to, of course, try to win more members to his following, which was basically a very simple pietistic following that said, once you're perfect, you're perfect. You can no longer sin. And that sounded pretty appealing to a lot of people. And as a result, he did win quite a few people, most of whom came to or settled in this immediate area around Bishop Hill. And his writings were very unique and really not much understood or known outside of his sect because of the fact that he was a self-taught Swedish farmer preacher. He was not a theologian. He was a farmer trader who got hooked by the pietistic movement and decided that it was the way to go. And so he started a movement which became called Eric Jansonist movement. And he brought about 1,100 people across the ocean over a period of a couple of years and founded this particular community and several just like them in the area. A lot of people that ended up in Victoria, in Galesburg, in the Quad Cities, all came because they had been enamored of Bishop Hill's teachings through Eric Janson. And as a result of these efforts, he became either very popular or very unpopular. And one of the most unpopular things he did was to forbid his young cousin, who was under his protection, from leaving the colony if she ever married. And she agreed to it. And when her husband, who was an outsider, came in and wooed and wed her, he tried his best to take her out of Bishop Hill. He wasn't real successful. He got as far as Chicago, and they dragged her back to Bishop Hill. But at any rate, this went on for several years. And finally, the guy who had tried to marry his cousin, a guy by the name of John Root, got very upset with Janson and threatened to kill him. And Janson was well aware of this. So he did what any smart man would do. He got out of town. And getting out of town in the 1840s and 50s was as easy as getting on a Mississippi River steamer and heading south to a place like St. Louis, which he did, because St. Louis was also a wonderful place to trade artifacts that were being made in Bishop Hill, like carriages and things that horse-drawn animals or horse-drawn vehicles needed. And he did it well, but he also endured himself to this man, John Root, to the point that Root threatened to kill him. So he fled down to St. Louis, and there he wrote two very interesting letters, very close to each other, in April of 1850, just weeks before he was murdered in Cambridge by John Root at the Cambridge courthouse during a recess, during a trial. The gentleman in question, John Root, happened to be carrying a couple of 6 guns on him and had a conversation, if you want to call it that, with Eric Janson through the window of the courthouse, which ended up in Janson calling him a few names and suggesting that a wife for his would be better to be a hog than a woman. So it did not set it well with this guy. And so John Root shot him. And he was brought back to Bishop Hill and laid to rest after several days, and is now remaining out there at the colony cemetery. But at any rate, There were 2 letters that Eric Janson wrote just days before he was murdered, back to Bishop Hill. And both of them speak volumes about who Eric Janson was, what he thought, how he acted, and what finally happened to him. Eric Janson fled immediately to St. Louis when he knew he was under threat of being shot by this man. And he stayed down there for a few days and was in the process of trading goods from Bishop Hill that were being made here for cash that needed to come back and pay the bills in Bishop Hill. In other words, it was an interesting economic exchange. The people in Bishop Hill were working hard to produce products, especially horse-related products, buggies and this sort of thing, and selling them to places like St. Louis, which was a booming town at the time and not too far from here by boat. And it was very easy for them to ship a quantity of material from Bishop Hill over to the Mississippi and down to St. Louis, where it was sold at a good profit. But nonetheless, it still caused problems for Eric Janson to get enough money to keep the colony going, because there were some 700 to 800 people here who were in the process of trying to build a community from basically wilderness. When they got here in the late 1840s, there were no finished buildings except for a few huts. And that's how they got started building Bishop Hill. And they did it on the backs of 600 or 700 willing immigrants who had all settled with them in Bishop Hill. But at any rate, what happened was that towards the very end of his life, literally days before he was murdered, he wrote 2 letters back to Bishop Hill talking about his experience. And I'm just going to quote in summary a bit of what he says. The first is one that was written from St. Louis on the 17th of April in 1850. And he says in the very first sentence, "I have earlier told you that my life has been in dugouts and wilderness, and it was true. But it's also true that now I am here in this city, St. Louis, where he was trying to develop industry or commercial contacts with Bishop Hill. And it worked to an extent. But at any rate, he was also trying to stay out of the way of this man, John Ruth, who wanted to kill him because he was trying to keep John Ruth's wife captive within the community. Not really captive, it just was captive in his thoughts. She was no friend of leaving Bishop Hill. She liked Bishop Hill. But at any rate, these are just a few of the things that he said in his letter back to Bishop Hill, first in early April and then in mid-April. The first one he says, and I find out we could get at least $2 a year if I worked with all my might to find it. $2 a year. I walked last Monday some 6 or 8 miles to find it, and finally found a couple who had flax to sell, flax seed, because in Sweden, flax was an important cash product to be turned into linen. And the Eric Jansonists brought that tradition with them across the sea and actually grew flax here and turned it into linen, very good linen. But at any rate, the bottom line is that he got here and finally found somebody down in St. Louis who was willing to buy the flax that they were selling, but not at the price that they wanted. And it turned out to be a very, very trying effort on part of Eric Janson to get any money at all out of St. Louis. Even though St. Louis was a great market for the stuff that Bishop Hill was making, especially things relating to buggies and wagons and horses and all of the tackle that went with that. And he says in his first letter, "Friends, I know in my spirit that some are departing from the truth." In other words, from his faith. "And I begin to believe that it is peaceful and that it is no longer any danger afoot. But Satan has taught me this." He knew that Satan was out to get them. At least that's the way he expressed it. And he says, "Dear children, do not be children in your understanding, but children in your desires, and perfected in your understanding." That's where he got the idea of perfectionism. Once you were perfect, you could no longer sin, and since you were no longer sin, you were perfect. Worked pretty well. And he did go on to close in saying, "Your millstones around my neck." He was literally, physically responsible for some 600 people living here and trying to get them to work harder and better and make products that could be sold in places like St. Louis, down the river. And he was more or less successful. But on his second letter, on the 20th of April, 1850, just about a week before he was murdered, he says, "You know how the devil goes around like a roaring lion to devour you. And when he has finished one thing, he begins another." In other words, the devil was never through with him. And he says, "Friends, I have certainly said that we shall take out of darkness everything we need during a hard time." In other words, if we have something that we have made well, we can take it down to St. Louis and sell it and make money. The only trouble was, as he traipsed around the streets of St. Louis, he didn't find too many people that were interested in Swedish products from Bishop Hill. So he was continuously in debt to the people in St. Louis. And he also noticed that if you couldn't do it by hook, you could do it by crook. And he said that I have nothing worse than what God, by Israel's misleading of Pharaoh, did to the Egyptians when they fled the Egyptian captivity. In other words, his sect's leaving Sweden was no worse than the Jewish people leaving the Egyptians. Very much the same. And if you had to lie to do it, you lied. That's the way it worked. And he goes on to say that at the same time, we have to work to pay off our debts. One thing I will not keep from you is that all scriptures concerning us shall be realized. In other words, God was on their side. And he said, should God then not use lies and deception to put the holy ones to shame? If God can do it, we can do it. And that was one of the reasons why the Eric Jansonists were quite often blamed for being purveyors of falsehoods. They were simply following the biblical example of the Israelites. And finally, he closes his first letter by saying, and what do we do then? Is it not best to root the bad people out? Since they will not serve us, but will be their own people. So that was the start of the leaving of a lot of the people from Bishop Hill to other communities like Victoria or Andover or any number of cities nearby like Galesburg. It simply was not easy for them to get along with what was going on in Bishop Hill. And then in his second letter, let me find the part that is kind of interesting. Here's how he justifies what they're saying. But I am sure before God that I have never done anything worse than what God did by Israel's misleading Pharaoh and the Egyptians. In other words, you remember the story about the effort to get people away from Egypt by the Exodus. And Moses went to Pharaoh and said, hey, look, Pharaoh, we're going to go out and we're going to have a religious conference for 3 days. And we'd like to take all of our children with us. And we'd like you to feed us. And so he promised to provide them with 3 days of provisions. And so off went all of the Israelites from Egypt and headed towards the promised land by telling one really humongous lie to the Pharaoh's leadership back in Egypt. And it's kind of an interesting thing that Janson used to support their telling similar lies to similar authorities in this country. It just happened that way. And he went on and said, should God not then use these lies and deceptions to put the holy ones to shame? In other words, we can tell lies if it's going to make the other people look bad. And he did. They did it pretty regularly. But at the same time, he was looking at what was going on inside the colony here. And he said, and what shall we do? They cry, the people that want to leave. It is not best that we root them out, since they will not serve us and will be their own people. And so quite a few of the Eric Jansonists that came here did exactly that. They went to little towns like Victoria or Galesburg or the Quad Cities, fleeing what was going on in Bishop Hill. And the people in Bishop Hill thought they were terrible for doing that. But on the other hand, the people that fled were happy to get out of the place and find a new start in places like Victoria or Moline or Galesburg. And there are really cute stories from Galesburg Lutheran clergy talking about the repentant Eric Jansonists that show up in their congregations, but still believing that they were perfect. That did not sit too well with either the Lutheran clergy or a lot of the congregations. But that gives you a sense of the kind of letters that this guy was writing to people in Bishop Hill and to people outside of Bishop Hill too. Let's see if I can pick just one or two more little things. Oh, here it is. One of the interesting visits that was coming to St. Louis in the 1840s and 50s were artists like Jenny Lind. And Jenny Lind had a whole traveling group that went with them carrying her money. And she was a very generous lady. And most Swedish immigrants that came to St. Louis to hear her sing also came to plead for money, including the Eric Jansonists. And the Eric Jansonists said they appeared to be standing behind Janson's unsuccessful attempts to secure a larger donation from Jenny Lind. In other words, everybody understood that these Bishop Hill people that were coming down to listen to Jenny Lind were also coming down to get some of their money to help restore the financial balance in Bishop Hill. And it didn't work, but it was worth the effort. They tried it. And I mentioned that he was begging for pretty small money. He went to a guy by the name of Mr. Blow, and he wanted to buy 100 bushels of flax for $1.65, though they could have sold it for a lower price than it now is. I do not know any other way than God has given Jacob and Israel's sons a bowl for their things. In other words, he was hoping to convince other Swedes or friends of Sweden to give money to support Bishop Hill. And it didn't always work. In effect, they ended up going home almost empty-handed from St. Louis. And he's also aware of what's going on inside of Bishop Hill. He says, "Friends, I know in my spirit that some of you are departing from the truth and begin to believe it is peaceful and there is no danger. But Satan has taught me this. Not what more should I wish than to get confirmation that there is no danger awaiting me, but this is not planted in my soul." That's what Eric Janson was writing back to his friends in Bishop Hill, just days before he himself was killed at the hands of John Ruth, a suitor who had lost his wife to the Eric Jansonists. And he ended up going to jail for a short time after he killed Ruth, or after he killed Eric Janson. But Ruth was then released by the governor because he felt sympathetic with the guy who lost his wife at the same time. And he ended up freeing John Ruth from his imprisonment and sending him off to other opportunities. And the way Janson closes his letter is kind of interesting too. He says, "God, who has saved me from the mouth of the lion and the jaws of the wolf, give you peace and grace now and for eternity." And that gives you a sense of Janson's strong belief in himself as a tribute to his relationship with God. And it also gives you a sense of understanding why people didn't think too much of him, because of the fact that he was pretty high-handed, and he didn't make any sense about it. He closes after looking at what happened to Israel. Should God then not use lies and deceptions to put his holy ones to shame? Yes, I ask God to do the right, to give us protection from the Egyptians, or in this case, for all the people that didn't like Eric Jansonism. He spoke pretty bluntly. And the funniest thing about this whole series of letters is that they are still here in the colony archives. And if anyone wants to read them and understand Swedish, they can do it. But in the meantime, they're there as a tribute to what they were going through in terms of not only Eric Janson's particular beliefs, but also people like the wife and the unhappy husband who couldn't get his wife out of the colony because she was related to Eric Janson as a cousin, and Eric Janson was her protector. And one of the protections that he placed upon her was that she could not leave the community, even if she got married. And obviously, John Ruth was not too happy about that, because John Ruth was an outsider who had come into the colony after having fought in the Mexican War, I believe. And along with a couple of other people, mixed it up with the young ladies in the colony. And he finally talked this Charlotta into perhaps marrying him and leaving the colony. And Janson told him, "No way, Charlie. She's staying here because that's what the agreement is between me and my young cousin, that she cannot leave the colony without permission." So that's is in essence the story of two very long letters. And for those that want to read the entire series of letters, they can do that because we brought, I think, extra copies of the letters here, and they're back on the back table up there, and you can take them home and read them at your own time. And to me, the funniest thing about these two letters is that they were discovered by an Augustana graduate who came to Augustana in 1875 and worked for several Swedish language newspapers before he became the author and editor of the Augustana Book Concern in Rock Island from 1911 to 1949. He wrote an awful lot of stuff, not just against Eric Janson, but he also wrote a total of 4 original hymns and translated some 30 more, including his most famous one, and one which most every Swedish American knows, called Children of the Heavenly Father. They were written by the same man who discovered these Eric Janson's letters and saw fit to get them published in a magazine by the Augustana Synod called Ungdomsvännen, the Friend of Youth. Obviously, he wanted to make sure that the Friends of Youth did not turn into Eric Jansonists. That's what he was doing.